We continue to look at a year of discipleship, and if you remember right, last week we started talking about the interior life, what is inside of us if we are truly living out the call to be disciples of Jesus Christ in the world. Last week, if you were here, I hope you remember we talked a little bit about celebration. This week we are going to turn 180 degrees, because what I want to talk about is the nature of the interior life of the disciple as it relates to confession. Now, I'll admit, as I started putting this together, I knew that that was part of the interior life of a disciple. I just couldn't figure out why. You ever had that problem? You know something is true, but you just can't make the pieces fit together? Well, they finally came together, and they came together because I flipped back in my life about 50 years. About 50 years ago, living in Topeka, I had the privilege of becoming part of Troop 16 of the Boy Scouts of America, affiliated with First United Methodist Church of Topeka, Kansas. It was a wonderful, wonderful experience, the 6 or 7 years I spent with that troop before I left. One of the things that was absolutely the best about it was we had some really interesting leaders. And I use that phrase intentionally. One of the most interesting was a guy named Bob Cotton. Now, Bob was a medical doctor. And I do not know the size of his practice, but I cannot imagine that he really had time to carve out of his busy schedule and his family life to spend time with the Boy Scouts of America, particularly the guys in Troop 16. I think the only reason he did was because his son Ricky was part of it, and so, he kind of felt obligated to help out. Now, the intriguing thing about Bob Cotton was that he gave us a gift that nobody else in the troop really could give quite like he did, and that was the opportunity to gather at 7 o'clock on a Saturday morning. What was he thinking? But we all gathered out at Gage Park in Topeka, and we spent Saturday mornings learning to identify every bird in the world by its look, by its song, by its nest. I mean, we all became bird lovers on Saturday morning at 7 o'clock. Partly because that's what Bob Cotton expected us to do. And just about the time we'd get fed up with the birds, we'd show up on a Saturday morning. He said, "This morning we don't care about birds. This morning we are going to learn about trees." And we ended up being able to identify every tree in Gage Park by its height, its shape, its bark, its leaves. I mean, we were great at tree identification. Now, honesty compels me to say I have forgotten 99.9% of everything I learned from Dr. Robert Cotton. But I think there's a reason for that, and I don't think it's because I got too old to care about trees and birds. I think it's because when you're 12 years old and it's 7 o'clock on Saturday morning, you really don't want to get out of bed to go wander through a park. I mean, we did. But there were a lot of Saturdays when the folks would come in because they had to wake up early enough, to have the bowl of cereal and the glass of milk. And I'd say, "Not today, I'm sleeping in today." I've never been an early riser. And I established that pattern when I was 12. One of the things I found out was that if I missed a couple of weeks and then I went back to the park, I spent all my time either trying to remember what I'd already learned or trying to catch up with what I hadn't learned. And it just kind of got in the way. It kind of kept me from learning what I needed to learn about trees and birds. And it really was interesting. I thought it was intriguing stuff. I just was not regular enough in my learning to make the process bear the fruit that it should have borne later on in my life. What's that have to do with discipleship? See, discipleship is, remember, not about membership. It's not about belief. A disciple is a learner. And I suspect one of the things that I found out when I was 12 years old wandering around Gage Park was that the really important part of the learning process about trees and birds and everything else we talked about on those Saturday mornings happened because we were in the presence of the teacher. And we were in the presence of fellow learners who kept us on task. You did not want Bob Cotton to ask you to identify a tree that you should know and come up blank because everybody else would laugh at you. I got laughed at a lot. See, discipleship and learning is based somehow in staying in relationship with the teacher. And the gospel story from Luke this morning talks about the key element of that, which is confession. Jesus tells the parable of the two people, one the Pharisee, who's standing on the street corner very publicly saying, God, I thank you that I am not like these other people. Notice what happens right up front. Right up front, he builds a wall that separates him from everybody else. By his own admission, I'm not like them. And then, rather than focus on who he is to start with, he focuses on who they are. Well, they're adulterers, and they're rogues, and they're tax collectors, and they're the scum of the earth. Only later does he get around to trying to tell God who he is. I fast and I give 10% of everything I have. Thank you very much. I am a good person. The second person in the story is the sinner standing down on the corner, who in his humility will not even lift his eyes to heaven, but instead beats his breast and says, God, forgive me, for I am a sinner. See, I think in that confession, we find the glue that binds us in relationship with the teacher. As long as the focus is on others and on how good we are, then ultimately what we're saying is we have no need of God. We already know everything we need to know about the faith and about being in relationship with God and about being in relationship with each other. And what the Pharisee does in that prayer that he is publicly proclaiming from the temple is that he doesn't need God. That he doesn't have to worry about that relationship. He has it all. But the other, the man who starts, Father, forgive me, for I have sinned, begins by naming the relationship. Not God, but Father. Someone who is close to you that you can depend on, who can be a teacher in your life. And by proclaiming himself a sinner, he is saying, I'm broken, I don't know it all. I need to learn, I need help figuring out what it means to be a person of faith, living in full relationship with God. I need help being a disciple of Jesus Christ. And I'm convinced, absolutely convinced, that if we are not people of confession, if our interior life is not shaped by and filled by a desire, a need, a yearning to confess to God the nature of our brokenness, then we cannot live in full relationship. And like a 12-year-old scout in Topeka, Kansas, we remove ourselves from the presence of the teacher. And if discipleship, as I suspect, is really about learning, then the worst thing we can do is remove ourselves from the presence of the teacher. When I was not with Bob Cotton in Gage Park, I didn't learn anything about birds and trees. And when I am not in full relationship with God, I don't learn anything about the nature of God and who God is and who I am and whose I am and how I am called to live out my life. Being a disciple of Jesus Christ and following the command in Matthew, making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Maybe of all of the things that we talk about in terms of the interior life, and we've got 3 more to do over the next 3 weeks, maybe at the core of it all is an interior life marked by the power of confession. Maybe that's why every Sunday when we gather in this community of faith, one of the things we do is confess our sin. Maybe the most powerful thing that happens on Sunday morning in this community of faith happens in those few brief moments when we say to our God, I am broken, I am a sinner, forgive me. And we do that knowing that God has promised that if we are faithful to confess, He is faithful to forgive. The relationship is cemented, it is healed. We find ourselves more fully in the sacred presence of the teacher who can make us disciples, certainly for our benefit, but more than that, so that our God might be honored and glorified in the midst of the world. We invite you to remain seated.